Before embracing the OSR style of play, I used to be concerned with the realism of dungeons and lairs that characters would explore. Simulationism seems not so much in vogue these days, and a more abstract mythic underground is favoured, which I like on occasion as well. However, there are times when the anachronistic unrealism of dungeons gets in the way of verisimilitude, such as was seen in B1 In Search of the Unknown. There, the winding passages illogically encircle the living quarters of inhabitants that surely would not be able to survive comfortably within such a lair. When presented with such a dungeon, I have the urge to amend it to make it make more sense, and in such situations I like to consider what is actually required to do so. It's possible to get new ideas as you develop realistic spaces, and it can even be a benefit to players to have some logic behind a dungeon. Knowing there is a food storage area or a well somewhere can help adventurers deal with the dungeon more effectively, with the help of poison, for example. The ideas I am putting forward now should not be dogmatically followed. There is certainly space for abstract and illogical monster layers, but if you wish to create more rational spaces for your players to explore, these ideas may be of some use. When trying to make a dungeon realistic, consider logical explanations as to how or why the dungeons are either designed the way they are or inhabited in the way they are. Principally, this means providing areas that allow for the very existence of the inhabitants. For this, I like to refer to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which serves as a great starting point for thinking about creature needs and desires in a fictional setting. These needs and desires can help to inform which rooms should be included in a dungeon or monster lair. A lair would not exist if it didn't fulfill at least the physiological and security needs of the group, so we can generate a list of essential rooms. Following that, further rooms that meet the other needs can appear, or be used to inspire ideas. Though not every single one of these requirements and their accompanying rooms need to be included, some should be added to add some interest or verisimilitude to the lair. Let's begin with the physiological needs of the dungeon inhabitants. Firstly, clean air and oxygen. The lair should be breathable for air-breathing creatures, i.e. not underwater. However, monsters vary a great deal, and what is considered bad air to humans may not be so for goblins, trolls, or ghouls. It may be that the whole dungeon has a breathable atmosphere, or perhaps only parts of it are habitable. One could even include a magical airlock or air filtration system, which is required to sustain the lair's population. Thinking about the air quality of the dungeon can provide interesting challenges to the party as they explore. Goblins may live in a mould-encrusted lair which poses no problem for them, but may cause breathing difficulties to the adventurers. A ghoul lair may be choked by poisonous smoke, fatal to intruders but completely ignored by the undead. Next we consider homeostasis and shelter. While homeostasis covers a large range of variables, I would focus on body temperature and consider this at the same time as the physiological need for shelter. The temperature of the lair should be appropriate to the inhabitant, either through the placement of the lair or through controlling the lair's temperature with fire or magical methods. Fires may be necessary in cold climates, but burning fires requires fuel, which in turn needs to be stored somewhere, and some kind of ventilation system may be required lest the area fill with smoke. More complex heating methods may even be employed in the lair. For example, a huge pool of molten lava could be found in the depths of a lair, and the heat from this pool may be channeled through ducts or a hypercourse system to heat the floors of the dungeon rooms. Some other magical means could even be used to artificially cool the lair in very hot climates or for creatures that prefer the cold. Again, you can present challenges to the characters if they encounter an area of the dungeon that is too hot or cold to navigate. In addition to temperature control, other weather effects may play a role in the design of a lair. Most creatures will want protection from the elements by building their lair underground or covering it with a roof. Lizard folk, on the other hand, may eschew roofs to bask in the sun or revel in the rain. Undead and those sensitive to light may have many more protections against the sun by putting their lairs deep underground, and vampires will make it almost impossible for sunlight to pose any danger to them. One of the most important considerations for any settlement is its proximity to water. Dungeon inhabitants will need to be close enough to a source of clean water, whether that be a spring, river, or well. Of course, some creatures, such as undead, will not require water, but most will. As well as supporting the dungeon inhabitants, it may be important for the adventurers to secure a source of water if they intend to spend a long time exploring the lair. It would be worth considering the storage of water and how the inhabitants prepare the water if it's not potable immediately. The water source may even be outside of the lair itself, in the case of a river or lake. In which case, enemies may be encountered collecting or transporting water to their lair from without. If the lair contains a magic user, the solution to water access may even be magically solved. Water is not only used for consumption, but also in agriculture and industry, so consider how some kind of irrigation or water pipes may appear in a lair, and how water could be required in industrial endeavours such as smithing. Cleaner creatures may even bathe, and baths may be connected directly to a water source. Of course, many monsters may not require water, or maybe even some other liquid that sustains them. And of course, you may wish for an aquatic lair, in which case the inhabitants require water to breathe. Such underwater lairs obviously pose a significant challenge to adventurers without magic. Another very important resource is food, and while food is usually considered in adventure writing, the amount tends to be underestimated. The proximity of food may be further than that of water, and the inhabitants can travel further or wait longer to obtain their meal than is required for the consumption of water. Many dungeon inhabitants will prey on other denizens of the dungeon, and while it is not expected that the DM consider the entire ecology of the lair, how the main monsters interact should be considered, establishing which monsters prey on one another and who is highest in the food chain. Most large groups of monsters will not rely only on hunting prey. They will likely require a source of food production as well, though not necessarily their own. The lair could be on the edge of farmland, which they raid intermittently. Or the lair could be next to a forest teeming with wildlife or a coastline to be fished. Many types of food can be harvested within the lair itself, some of which may be quite inappropriate for human consumption, such as strange subterranean mushrooms, mosses, and other plants. Think about the normal diet of the inhabitants and try to feature that food source in or near the lair. Monsters may keep livestock of some form in their lair, whether animals or humanoids, though captured livestock will require additional food if the captors wish for them to remain fat and healthy before the slaughter. As well as capturing, growing, and scavenging food, the members of a dungeon tribe may need to prepare, cook, store, and serve food. Most of the rooms in the lair will be probably designed to aid these tasks in some way, as eating is one of the most important activities undertaken by any creature. Consider adding some form of kitchen, larder, butchery, or banquet hall appropriate to the type of dungeon inhabitants. Most creatures need to sleep, and even if they don't, they are likely to have an area of repose. The main consideration to make is whether sleeping areas are individual or communal. This may apply to the whole group or to a select amount, where the creatures are divided into separate sleeping quarters by rank, sex, age, profession, or other category. The sleeping quarters are likely to be in the safest part of the lair, and will likely be the most sheltered and defensible part of the lair. While not as advanced as the modern age, or even maybe the medieval age, the fantasy world would have some professionals and locations designed for healthcare. Many monstrous races may not care for the sick and eschew such rooms, while others may combine their healthcare with religious activity. Such rooms should be a boon to the PCs as the most likely sites to find curative potions. A hospital or infirmary room may be extremely basic and be combined with other rooms in the dungeon, if it is included at all. Healing is more likely to be in the form of a religious ritual or potions concocted by an alchemist or cook. Unfortunately, not all those who are sick will make it, and bodies must be disposed of. The manner in which this is done will vary between each creature, and maybe death is even the preferable state to be in. Depending on the creature, you can choose to include a crypt or grave of some sort, or bodies could be discarded somewhere else in the dungeon. Another element of the health category is the disposal of waste. For humans, close proximity to waste can cause all sorts of diseases, and the same will hold true of many other creatures. However, it may be that some creatures, on the contrary, will desire to be around waste, such as troglodytes and insect-like creatures. Some may not even care about its presence, such as the undead. Privies and cesspits are not particularly interesting features in a dungeon, so it's only worth a cursory thought. Don't make a big deal out of such rooms unless you want to focus on a rather gruesome event around that site. The next tier in the hierarchy of needs is safety, which is a category very likely to interface with the adventurers as they attempt to enter the dungeon. One of the most obvious places to start with keeping inhabitants safe is to keep threats out of the dungeon. This is most easily addressed with a wall and a strong door, but there are many preventative measures which can be employed in addition. The first of which is deterrence, through signs and markers which signal danger. Traps of various forms are often utilised by monsters, remembering to have some way of circumventing them by the inhabitants, though traps are often more common as a way of capturing or killing food than as a preventative measure. Guard rooms, watchtowers, ambush sites and the like are good for perimeters of the inhabited area as well as the wider area beyond the habitation. Remember that deterrents are more valuable than repulsion methods, so inhabitants may go out of their way to make entrance into the lair look more difficult than it actually is. Creatures are more likely to favour defences that do not need to be manned, rather than expending a certain number of population at all times. A well-designed dungeon will have multiple entrances and exits, each with their own defensive needs. Some exits may be designed as escape routes for the inhabitants if their lair gets overrun. Some routes in or out of the lair will also be hidden, requiring little defence, but a dangerous vulnerability if discovered. The defensive rooms remain empty or useless unless they are occupied and prepared. The most obvious preparation would be the training and equipping of defenders, which could require an armourer and barracks. Depending on how large the group is, some form of training area may be present, or some other school such as that for laying and arming traps. A trap maker and his workshop may also be required. One line of defence may be trained animals or monsters, in which case there may be a need for some kind of cage or kennels, as well as a way to feed these guardians. However, the best preparation for defence is knowledge of threats. Scouts, watchtowers, and other forms of information gathering and alerting may appear far from the lair, allowing plenty of time for preparation for any intruders. Once an attack has been repelled, the inhabitants may have rooms dedicated to storing those killed or captured. Information from the surviving attackers will need to be obtained somehow, and villains do tend to enjoy a good torture room. Damage to the outer defences may need to be rebuilt or repaired, though this could be managed in a previously mentioned workshop. Victims of an attack may need healing or bed rest, utilising the hospital-type room discussed previously. In some very specific cases, the inhabitants may wish to carry out some kind of legal proceedings against those who invaded, or those who failed to repel the attack in a timely fashion. Though unlikely, some monsters may be lawful enough to require a courtroom of some kind. The possibility of attack from without is not the only consideration for a monstrous group. Safety in the everyday against others of the same type is also a concern. The separation of rooms with locked doors between can help protect against theft and other crimes by the inhabitants themselves, especially with creatures prone to such activity, such as goblins. Normally, only those with a high enough status will have their own quarters, and enough material possessions to warrant locked doors and chests. It is always worth remembering that each locked door should have a key, and each key should be somewhere, usually in the pocket of its owner. This is an important and often overlooked consideration by DMs. One of the most likely rooms to be locked, guarded, and possibly trapped is the treasure room, the room most tempting to the invader. It is worth considering that some monsters will not protect their abode from intrusion, either because they do not need to, or because they actually want foolish adventurers to delve within. Some creatures may be so powerful that they do not feel the need to take any steps to defend themselves. Other creatures may not even have the capability to set up defences. Many of these defensive steps could be taken using magic instead of physical structures and henchmen. Magical walls of force, golems, or summoned creatures, and even enchantment traps which suggest to the invaders that they should leave. The next tier of the hierarchy is love and belonging, which may seem irrelevant to the monstrous entities that inhabit forbidding caves and dungeons, but most of these needs focused around the communal aspect of the creature's existence. With this need category and the ones higher on the pyramid, they are more applicable to higher intelligence creatures and those who already have their lower needs met. There are, of course, exceptions. This set of needs focuses on the complex connections between members of a tribe, family, or group, and for the purposes of the dungeon, it's possible to simplify this category to describe rooms with a social function. Social interactions will be fairly normal among intelligent beings, and creatures will likely have a place to interact with others. These interactions could be as simple as conversations among friends to sports and drinking games. Most social interaction can occur within other areas, especially communal sleeping areas or eating areas, but given the opportunity, creatures will try to establish dedicated spaces for social interaction. The way in which monsters socialize may be quite alien to humans, so you can allow for some creativity here. Acceptance into the overall group or tribe is necessary for most individuals. There will always be outliers, but acceptance into smaller subgroups within the larger group is often sought. The subgroups are normally hierarchical in nature, have certain requirements for entrance, and sometimes are at odds with other groups within the same tribe. The most obvious group that most members of the tribe will belong to is a religious group, and most, if not all, creatures will be a part of the same religious group. Other groups can include gangs, sports teams, clubs, or professional organisations. There may be one or more rooms dedicated solely to the group in question, but many rooms within the dungeon could be associated in some way with different groups. For example, one room of the dungeon could be a temple to the inhabitant's god, but many other rooms could have aspects relevant to the temple and god as well. The tavern could be used to perform religious ceremonies, the chief's room could be used for monthly sacrifices, and the storeroom may contain the religious texts. If the tribe is large enough, you can come up with a handful of social factions and distribute their influence over several rooms, whilst having one or two rooms dedicated to a single social group. You can use these factions to impart knowledge about the creatures to the players, as well as create differences in the factions that the characters can in some way exploit. Love and family is possibly the least relevant category when dealing with monsters, but it doesn't have to be totally overlooked. Members of a tribe may divide themselves by family into separate rooms or buildings. Within that family, there may be separation between children, parents, siblings, and other family members, suggesting the age of creatures found in each room. Family ties could inform the tactics employed by the dungeon dwellers when adventurers attack. For example, the fighters of the tribe could rush to protect family or those that they have an intimate tie with. This category is probably the least useful to consider and can be overlooked, but you may want to come up with some interesting ideas or role-playing hooks based on the emotional or obligational ties the creatures have. At the very least, the DM can divide up the sleeping quarters of the inhabitants into multiple areas. Of course, some creatures may have no familial link whatsoever. I tend not to dwell on this category much, as I find the moral quandary of characters killing monstrous young to be tiresome. It also requires some thought into the reproductive process of the monsters, which is also not a necessary element of the game, in my opinion. The next tier is the need for esteem. This tier of the hierarchy deals with the need for respect from peers, as well as having self-respect. Monsters may function in wildly different ways to humans, but it is worth working under the assumption that monstrous creatures will seek respect or recognition in some way, even in a manner that seems alien to us. It would be easy to get unnecessarily bogged down with the intricacies of esteem needs, so it is best to focus on the hierarchy within the tribe or group in question. This will be more apparent in very tribal groups, such as orcs or goblins, and may be more important than some of the lower needs that have been already discussed. It is quite possible that a tyrannical orc warboss will focus on establishing his throne room and living quarters, even while the rest of the tribe has not secured a reliable source of food. For respect, prestige, and recognition, there could be two types of room within the dungeon that concern the leadership of a group. Those rooms which are functional to the purpose of ruling, and those that are used to express authority without necessarily having a tangible utility. Throne rooms and audience chambers are used primarily for the purpose of ruling, though they should have an aesthetic quality that fulfills the second purpose. It may be that such rooms will be prioritized over those which fulfill functions lower in the hierarchy, depending on the creatures. Rooms such as galleries, menageries, trophy rooms and the like are designed to promote prestige, even though they may have some additional function or aesthetic use. Finally, one expression of prestige is in the quantity of treasure that a leader owns. The treasure room will obviously be guarded and secured, but may be arranged in order to look as spectacular as possible for those who do view it, such as visiting dignitaries, diplomats, and chiefs from other groups. Not all tribes will have elaborate treasure rooms, as some leaders may prefer the utility of keeping treasure securely locked away in sturdy and trapped chests, perhaps even hiding their treasure in nondescript rooms. Esteem and respect will probably manifest more in actions than rooms and items, and invading PCs are unlikely to witness rituals and behaviour which solidify the respect between monstrous inhabitants. The DM can put small signifiers of esteem needs and the hierarchical difference between monstrous creatures, whether through the clothes they are dressed in, the relative size and quality of living quarters, the items and equipment borne by different ranks, and so on. Some types of creatures may eschew or subvert the expected esteem needs, perhaps having a society that barely differentiates rank, or even presents those of the highest ranks with fewer accolades and items. The higher parts of the pyramid of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, depending on the version looked at, encompasses the cognitive needs, aesthetic needs, self-actualization needs, and transcendent needs. These needs are interesting in that they are sometimes prioritized higher than needs lower in the pyramid, despite their apparent lower urgency. This can be seen in the real world when some people will prioritize fulfilling aesthetic needs or cognitive needs at the expense of social needs, for example. Therefore, if some dungeon occupants are lacking in basic needs, it will not automatically mean that these higher needs are not met in some way. The group of denizens may struggle to find a consistent source of food, but may still have a library in their lair. Regarding cognitive needs, most creatures of at least a certain intelligence will have a curiosity to find meaning, information, and understanding in things. This will not simply be learning from books, but understanding of their environment and those within it. It is likely that those of a higher intelligence will have elevated or far-reaching subjects of study, such as magic, the planes, psychology, economics, and the like, whereas those of lower intelligence may focus on things closer to their situation, such as crop production, engineering, or local fauna. But there is no reason why an orc, shaman, or goblin chief will not have a small library or writings on subjects typically unconnected to such creatures. As well as the obvious library, cognitive needs could be represented by a map room, workshop, laboratory, excavation site, or tunnels delving deeper into the underground. Next, aesthetic needs cover the desire for beauty and novel experiences which enhance the inhabitant's life. When dealing with humans, it is fairly clear what would be considered beautiful, such as paintings, sculptures, music, fashionable clothes, and the like. Other humanoids may have a very different sense of beauty, from the alien to the grotesque. Intricate mushroom colonies or piles of rotting skulls may appear beautiful to some species of monster, though the word beauty may lose its meaning at that point. Some creatures may consider nothing beautiful, or more specifically, a lack of things. To some species, an entirely empty room, flat and featureless, may appear beautiful. Of course, with such a broad definition, the DM is at liberty to consider the inclusion of anything as visually appealing to their monsters, but a degree of consistency should be applied so as not to seem completely random. Considering the aesthetic needs of monsters can also help to justify the inclusion of certain treasures which seem out of place in a cave system or dungeon. When placing rooms or objects designed to fulfill an aesthetic need, some indication of their purpose can help the PCs understand their inclusion in a dungeon. Therefore, it is a good idea to group some of these things into collections or have them central to a room with little else to distract from them. Galleries, gardens, wardrobes, treasure rooms, sculpture parks, pools, waterfalls, dioramas, windows, and music rooms are all examples of rooms which are primarily aesthetic. Self-actualization and transcendence are some of the highest needs to be attained, and are less frequently outwardly manifested. Many of the previous rooms discussed could fulfill this need. Self-actualization needs could be attained with the help of knowledge, so a library would be appropriate, whereas transcendence may be achieved by connection to the divine, so a temple would be required to fulfill this need. It may not be worth spending much time considering these needs, which are personal to an individual and very unlikely to make any impact on the dungeon crawl. One way to use all this information would be to first determine how well established the group is, and this will determine how many of the needs have been met. A group that has only just moved into the area may not have all of its needs met, while those that have been there for a long time may have met almost all their needs. Of course, a long-established group may have recently met with disaster and their needs may not be fully met. The size of the space being inhabited will also determine how many needs have been met and how many rooms are used for those needs. If you have not decided how well established the colony is, you can randomly determine how many needs have been met in each category. The most important categories to consider, if you do not consider anything else, are a water source, a food source, a sleeping area with heat if required, a cesspit, refuse area, or privy. So long as you consider these 4 categories when dungeon designing, the existence of the group makes sense, and you can either stop with the process of assigning rooms based on needs, or simply choose any of the other room types to fit your design. Leaving one or more of the physiological needs unmet or in jeopardy can create motivation for the creatures to act. A lack of food, for example, could be a reason why these monsters have started raiding the local village. If you have multiple groups of monsters, you can create conflict between them by sharing one need room with them. The 2 factions will either fight for that resource or come to some kind of truce. Having a single water source, such as a large pool in the centre of the dungeon, for example, can create conflict between all factions that need access to that water. Clever players will be able to exploit the rivalries between factions that contest the resources, determining treaties or triggering fights which weaken each faction. Remember that each of the required resources does not necessarily need to be the origin of that resource. Food, for example, may not be sourced in the dungeon, but rather foraged, farmed, or pillaged from the surrounding land, but there will need to be a storage room for that food. Once you have determined how the physiological needs have been met, populate the other rooms in the dungeon, favouring needs lower in the hierarchy before meeting those higher, or determining randomly. Keep generating rooms until you have filled the number of rooms required. Any needs the group is missing can be considered the current priority of the group, and can be used as a story hook or a noticeable characteristic of the tribe. If you're running a pre-written module or adventure, take a look at a map and see how many of the needs are met, modifying or adding rooms as you see fit to increase the verisimilitude of the dungeon. As a final thought, it is worth considering the architecture of the dungeon as well. The rooms which satisfy physiological needs should be the most easily accessible and central to the monster's living space. Less essential rooms can be less accessible, while rooms which deal with defense will likely be on the edges of the monster's lair. This is one way in which you might consider making a dungeon more realistic. As mentioned before, one should not dogmatically pursue realism, and in some cases it is more desirable to keep the dungeon space more abstract. However, approaching the dungeon space logically can create hooks and opportunities for you as a designer, as well as options for the players to exploit. Let me know in the comments what you think about this design idea, whether you like to keep your dungeons realistic, or if it is not something that concerns you. If you would like to support the channel, please like and subscribe the video, and you can also pick up one of my books. As usual, thanks for watching.